There is a sentiment online that's unfortunately very popular, where people seem to think that Game Freak doesn't know what they're doing when they make Pokemon games. And I just want to talk about that because people seem to think that, like, Game Freak should have Pokemon taken away from them or something like that. And it's really weird because Game Freak very much knows what they're doing, and all the decisions that they make that people complain about are not accidents, they are very purposeful decisions. Ultimately, what it boils down to is the Pokemon franchise is very purposefully trying to appeal to both core gamers and casual gamers. And when I say casual gamers, I mean like people that don't even play any other games. Maybe they play Animal Crossing, but they play very little. The Pokemon franchise really wants that audience because that audience is a big portion of their install base. See, simultaneously, they are trying to appeal to two very different groups of people, and that is why there are often decisions that are made in Pokemon games that don't appeal to that core gaming audience, and it's because those decisions are for the casual gamers. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee in particular was a game that was made very specifically for that casual gaming audience, because they realized that Pokemon Go had gotten so many more people into the Pokemon franchise, so they wanted to try to bring them into more of their games by having a game that's like halfway between a regular Pokemon game and a casual game. And then a few years later, they made Pokemon Legends Arceus, which is a game that's more intended to appeal to that core gaming audience, while sort of alienating that casual gaming audience. And that is why many of the changes that were made in Pokemon Legends Arceus are things that many people said was like their ideal Pokemon game. But then those changes were not kept for Scarlet and Violet, very specifically because they knew Legends Arceus was able to alienate that casual gaming audience, but Scarlet and Violet were not. And the reason why Legends Arceus could afford to alienate that casual gaming audience was because it released 2 months after Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. And Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were made for that casual gaming audience, while Legends Arceus was for the core gaming audience. And that split between those two games is highlighted just in the sales data. Sword and Shield sold 24 million copies, Legends Arceus sold 12, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl sold 14, and then Scarlet and Violet sold 10 million within 3 days of release, and kept going after that. So that really highlights that Legends Arceus and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were intended to be dual releases for different halves of the Pokemon fanbase, whereas Scarlet and Violet didn't have another game coming out next to it, so obviously they couldn't just keep everything from Legends Arceus in it. But then even on top of having Legends Arceus specifically aimed at the core gaming audience, and Let's Go specifically aimed at the casual gaming audience, every single Pokemon game has always tried to appeal to both crowds, to one extent or another, because they're all trying to be right in the middle of the two audiences, and have things that appeal to both sides. But then the issue comes in that the core gaming audience will always see these decisions that were made for the casual gamers and will say that they're bad, and Pokemon games are bad because of all of these things that are not appealing to them. But the reason why they don't appeal to them is because they're made for a different crowd. And this applies to, like, the very basics of Pokemon even. For example, the reason why Grass, Fire, and Water are the 3 starter types is because, one, those are 3 simple types, where for the most part you can kind of figure out for yourself what all the type matchups are for those. Like, obviously Fire is going to be good against Grass, because Fire burns Grass, but it's not going to be good against Water, because Water puts out Fire. Stuff like that. Whereas, you know, people like to suggest that maybe they should do Psychic, Dark, and Fighting, but then where is the logic in why Dark is weak to Bug and Fighting, right? If somebody hasn't played a Pokemon game before and you start them off with a Dark type, they're going to be confused as to why it's weak to certain types and strong against others, whereas Grass, Fire, and Water are good types to introduce you to the concept of type matchups. And that's also why, like, the first gym in most games interacts with those starter types, is because if you're learning how a type matchup works, because you've never played a Pokemon game before, you always want to have that first gym teach you type matchups specifically tied to your starter. That's why Rock was the first one in Generation 1, 3, and 4, because it's weak to both grass and water, and strong against fire. In Generation 5, it was very specifically saying, hey, this is a type matchup related to your starter, which is also why they gave you a monkey that helped you in that gym. But then Black and White 2 was normal because they kind of figured you would play the first game first, and then you don't really need to be taught stuff in the second one. Generation 6 had a bug type, so did Generation 9 for the first gym, although 9's complicated, but supposed to be a bug type, which is weak to fire and strong against grass. And then Generation 6, the second gym, was also Rock, so again, Rock interacts with all three of them. In Generation 7, the first totem Pokemon was a normal type, because they wanted to introduce you to what a totem battle was like, and then, after that, they did Water, Fire, Grass, which are the starter types. Generation 8, the first 3 gyms were Grass, Water, Fire. Again, helps you learn type matchups. Generation 2 was different in that it had a Flying type gym, but the philosophy behind Generation 2 was a bit different, because it was originally thought of as being Pokemon 2, so it was intended to be played by people that already played the first game, and it was also going to be the last Pokemon game, so they weren't really as concerned with teaching you the easy type matchups in that game because they had already thought that you had already played the first game, and instead the gyms are just the types that didn't have gyms in the first generation. So the start of every single Pokemon game tries to teach you type matchups, so that if you haven't played any other ones, that's why they do it this certain way. That's why you don't have, like, a Dragon type in the first gym. It's not just because most Dragon types are strong, it's also because it doesn't really interact with the Pokemon you're going to be getting, either. And then again, to try to appeal to a casual gaming audience, that's ultimately why it's highly unlikely that Mega Evolutions will ever come back, and that's because the Mega Evolution concept doesn't really work that well for the casual gaming audience, because it tells you, pick one of these 20 Pokemon, and they're all special in this very specific way. But ultimately, you know, for the casual gaming audience, they just want to play with Pokemon that they like. So instead of having a gimmick that's saying, hey, you'd want to pick one of these very specific Pokemon, they have other gimmicks that apply to all Pokemon. Z-moves can be used by any Pokemon. Gigantamax is only certain Pokemon, but then Dynamax is also there, so if you don't have a Gigantamax, you're fine. You can just do Dynamax instead. And then Terrestrialization, obviously, every single Pokemon can do it. So, you know, competitive Pokemon players like Mega Evolutions, but from a more casual perspective, Mega Evolutions are probably the worst of the gimmicks that they've made. And that is why they were cut, and they're probably not coming back. Maybe they will, but probably not. All of these various decisions and more are all very specifically done to appeal to the casual game audience over the core gaming audience. Because ultimately, I think what Game Freak has realized is that no matter what they do with the story or just like the single player experience in Pokemon, it's going to be very difficult to make the core gaming audience happy, unless they do something like Legends Arceus, but obviously they can't do that every single game, because then the casual game audience isn't going to like it. Because Legends Arceus is way more complicated. But because they've realized that, like, the single-player experience of Pokemon isn't really for the core gaming audience, instead, they realize that's why we gotta do competitive Pokemon. We have to really support that competitive side, and that's why every single generation you have new abilities and new items, various different strategies that you can do with all the new Pokemon. It's because they're very specifically doing that for the competitive side. And then on top of that, in the different games, they try to do different things that help teach you different strategies for competitive play. For example, the Island Trials in Sun and Moon kind of taught you double battle strategies a little bit, not that much, but a little bit. For example, the Grass Island Trial showed that you can use Sunny Day mixed with Solar Blade to make Solar Blade a one-turn move, which is a good idea for competitive strategy. That's also why you tend to have a double battle gym in most games, is because, again, competitive play is very built around double battles, so they want to teach you some ideas that you can then expand off of when you go into competitive play. And then in Scarlet and Violet, they used Iono's Gym to teach you that, hey, if this Pokemon knows Levitate and you give it an Electric Terra type, then suddenly it doesn't have any weaknesses. That's an idea for a strategy that you can then build off of. And then the False Dragon Titan showed you one of the new abilities that you can use for competitive play. So while on one hand, every single Pokemon game teaches you type matchups, so that casual gamers who haven't played Pokemon games before can always learn them, at the same time, there's typically spots where it tries to teach you competitive strategies for that core gaming audience, because the core gaming audience mostly wants the competitive play over the single-player experience. So at the end of the day, I just think we really need to move past this idea that Game Freak doesn't know what they're doing, because they really do. They know they need to appeal to a casual gaming audience, and all of those choices that make for a casual gaming audience aren't going to appeal to the core gaming audience. But then that core gaming audience is going to be very loud about how they don't like those choices, because they like being loud. But if you are someone who plays games all the time, you need to understand that there are going to be choices made in Pokemon games and in other games that are trying to appeal to casual gamers that you're not going to like, and that's okay, it's intentional. Not every single game needs to make every single decision specifically catered towards you. Because there's a lot of different people that play games, and they all have different tastes. So they're all going to like different things and dislike other things. That's okay. We're all different people. It's okay to be different. The reason why Pokemon Legends Arceus isn't going to be the new way forward for Pokemon is because it's going to alienate that entire casual gaming audience. Because the casual gaming audience that Pokemon tries to appeal to is like the most casual audience that is out there. They don't play any other games. If you give them a game that has action combat, they're not going to know what to do. So you can't do that in every single Pokemon game. That's why the catching system in Legends Arceus isn't in Scarlet and Violet. It's because that's action combat. Turn-based combat works a lot better for people that can't really get their heads wrapped around complicated combat, right? But yeah, at the end of the day, if you're the kind of person that said Pokemon Legends Arceus was exactly what you wanted from Pokemon, and you wanted every Pokemon game to be like that, you have to understand that that's because that one game was made for you. But not every Pokemon game is going to be made for you, okay? Maybe we'll get more Legends games, but I think if we do, they will probably be released alongside other things similar to Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, or similar to Let's Go. So maybe next time we get a Faithful remake alongside something like Legends Arceus, maybe you don't need to yell about how much you hate that Faithful remake so much. Just a thought.